All right, our thanks to Dana for presenting. And up next, we have the post NARS landscape, understanding the aftermath and how to move forward, presented by Douglas Miller. And Douglas is with Attorney RE. Douglas, welcome and please begin.
All right, thank you. Well, the lights are bright. All right, here we go. So imagine this. You take on a litigation case. And before trial, you call opposing counsel and say, how about you pay me a 3% bonus if I can get my client to settle before the end of the month? You get your client to settle, and then later, you tell your client, by the way, I got a bonus from the other side to make this deal happen. But don't worry about it, it's legal, because I just disclosed it to you. And it didn't cost you anything because it was free. If you're a lawyer doing that, it's called bribery, self-dealing, theft by swindle, pick your poison. Disclosure does not cure bribery. You would never do something like that. And yet in real estate, that's exactly how the system worked for decades. Listing brokers secretly offered money to the buyer's fiduciary. It was done through a hidden field, data field in the MLS that no one else could see. Sometimes these hidden fields even included bonuses on top of the 2.7% that was being offered. So how could a system of bribery exist for even a fraction of a second in a fiduciary environment like this? And I hate this next slide. Yeah, that's me. I've been in the trenches for a long time. That's from a Wall Street Journal article. I'm a real estate attorney. I have a brokerage license only so they can access the MLS and the Realtor Association's forms. But our case, I originated the Moehrl case. It was the class action that's basically raised hell in the entire real estate industry. We addressed the commission price fixing that's going on. It's a history-making antitrust action. It basically challenged the entire real estate structure nationwide. And a lot of people don't know it, but it started right here in Minnesota. So the idea is that the consumer shouldn't have to pay for a rigged system. My fight didn't start there. It started right out of law school in 1992 when I originated the country's first undisclosed dual agency case against Edina Realty, Dismuke versus Edina Realty. This was long before dual agency was even recognized as a problem. I've testified before Congress about the corruption in the title insurance industry, how realtors have essentially caused price fixing and artificial inflation of pricing and restraint of trade in that area. I started an independent title company. It became one of the largest in Minnesota. I started the only nonprofit charity dedicated to consumer protection in the real estate brokerage industry. I'm here to show you what's really happening after the settlement, why the reforms matter, and how attorneys can lead the way. This is the heart of the case, the buyer-broker commission rule. When competitors collude on pricing, there's no true competition. Prices stay high and consumers pay the price. On the MLS, listing brokers dictated their competitors' fees, locking in the cartel rate, 2.7% is what it is here, and punishing anyone who undercut those fees. When you publish a commission offer on the multiple listing service, you're not just cooperating with other brokers, you're dictating the going rate for your competitors, ensuring nobody undercuts that rate. That's why buyer broker fees have stayed artificially high and nearly identical nationwide. Now, it depends kind of where you are. 3% is often what you see in other parts of the country. But these prices didn't vary based on the service or experience, knowledge of these agents. They all got paid 2.7%. Our case targeted that system. Listing brokers using the MLS to signal and control buyer broker fees. This conspiracy was about sharing commissions with competitors on the MLS to suppress price competition, also to restrain trade. In what other profession could you call yourself active? Because this is about 71% of active real estate agents didn't close a deal last year. In what other profession could you call yourself active and go an entire year without doing the work you claim to do? When agents handle so few deals, they don't build the skills or judgment needed to represent clients well. Inexperience in this business, the real estate brokerage industry, means bad advice, poor drafting, missed issues, and costly mistakes for consumers. Yet they're all still collecting 2.7%. Most of the marketing money that agents brag about spending on your home, pardon me, isn't spent on your house. It's spent for self-promotion. Billboards, postcards, online ads, magazines, Facebook ads, all designed to get the next client, not to get your property sold. I do the same work realtors do right now. I wanted to prove a point that you can hire an attorney to do everything a realtor does for half as much money and still get great service. So I do it as a lawyer. So I never do dual agency. Some of the things that realtors will do, you get absolute fidelity. I use showing agents. A lot of what I do is virtual, but I wanted to prove that I could do this for half as much as a realtor and still get paid more than my $450 hourly rate. And I've done that. In fact, last year I was considered, and this, I say this tongue in cheek, but I was one of the top 100 realtors in Minnesota last year, even though I represent myself as an attorney to my clients. Yeah, last year was bad for agents, but 85% sold 2 or fewer homes last year. This is who you're hiring when you go to sell your house or buy a house. You've probably seen realtors bragging about how busy they are, talking about working around the clock, and that attorneys would never do that. They're just 9 to 5. It's amazing what comes out of the mouths of some of these people as they talk about the potential for competition from attorneys. Open houses. Don't sell houses. They're a way to get lead generation. It's an effort to market yourself, and there's even data from the Realtor Association that shows open houses don't sell houses, yet they're done all the time. So if they're not doing a lot of deals, they're often desperate for income. This desperation leads to self-serving advice, telling buyers to waive inspections, steering towards listings with bonuses, encouraging overbidding, or pushing a bad deal just to get a paycheck. Even if buyers do all the work and find the property themselves, they're still forced to use and pay for a buyer agent. In most cases, there's no option for a DIY buyer to save money. Realtors love to say, and you're going to hear this over and over again, commissions have always been negotiable. I want you to take a look at this slide. This is from pre-settlement, pre-lawsuit, when commissions to the buyer brokers were in a hidden field and you could search by it. And take a look at that right column and please tell me how commissions were negotiable if they were all 2.7%. It must have been just a coincidence, I'm sure. But this is what negotiable looked like in practice. Whether the house was 200,000 or 2 million, the number in that hidden field was almost always the same. And they concealed this information from their own clients, disclosing only later in an untimely manner that stripped consumers of the ability to give informed consent. All this, they're doing this while calling themselves fiduciaries. And if a broker dared to offer less than 2.7%, it would result in their listing being boycotted. And it's a very complex system, how it used to work. Buyers would pay the sellers for the house. The sellers would pay their listing broker, and the listing broker would pay the buyer broker. It's unnecessarily complex. And as you've probably heard, the best anti-competitive schemes are complicated by design. It could have been simple. Buyers pay their agents, sellers pay theirs. You could roll the buyer agent fee into the mortgage by including a clause in the purchase agreement. So many easy ways to do this, but simple makes collusion more difficult. And if the buyer wanted to negotiate the fee of the buyer agent using the standard realtor forms that are out there, the only way to do it was to get a buyer rebate. And then what would happen is that circle would be complete. It would go from the buyer to the seller to the listing broker to the buyer broker and then back to the buyer again. That's the only way you could negotiate with a buyer agent. Yet that option wasn't available, a rebate. So my nonprofit that I was talking about, CARE, somebody did this video for us a bunch of years ago. But we just saw how complex the commissions are. But one of the most important things you can know about this system is that the standard realtor fee agreements gave buyers no way to negotiate. They got whatever the seller was offering. When you took a look at these contracts, you could put a number in there, like 1% to the buyer agent, and you think you're negotiating that. But then if you read the fine print in the standard boilerplate that all the realtors were using, it said they could collect whatever the seller was offering. We'll come back to this later because the way those forms were written is a huge story all by itself. Now, here's the only way you could actually negotiate with a buyer broker. It's called a rebate, and I'm hoping we have sound for this.
We know what you're thinking. I'm the
Right.
buyer. How am I getting cash and where is it coming from? What few buyers understand is that buyer brokers' fees are negotiable. They're certainly not free. Let's say you purchase a home for $100. That would be nice, right? At closing, you give the seller $100. That's simple. But what happens after that? Unfortunately for the seller, their broker typically receives a 6% commission, which is then split with a buyer's broker. Instead of your broker's fee being negotiated, it is set by the seller's broker. We don't think that is fair. Normally, this is where the transaction ends. Each broker goes home with a 3% commission. But when using an agent who pays rebates, they provide the exact same service as other buyers as agents, and they pass some of their commission back to you.
That's how a rebate works, and under this system, it was the only way to actually reduce a buyer broker fee. But the standard fee agreements, of course, didn't allow for this. I call this my ugly slide, I'm sorry, but it's it is what it is. These are fiduciary contracts. The broker is supposed to put the client first, right? You can't use contracts to deceive your clients, but they did. This listing contract had no requirement to tell the seller how much they were going to be paying buyer brokers. And the form pre-filled 7, 8, 9, and 10% as the commission, making 6% look like a bargain. Kind of a tacky and deceptive practice, at least in my opinion. The buyer contract was just as bad, where they could collect whatever the seller was offering, but they made you think that you were actually negotiating it. You'd find out later that you weren't. Put together these standard realtor forms, locked in fees, hid the numbers, and guaranteed steering. Buyer broker contracts. One of the NAR settlement's biggest changes is that buyer brokers must have a signed buyer rep agreement before showing homes. But in Minnesota, that's technically been the law for years. Realtors here love to say, this is nothing new. We've always had a law that's required that. But in practice, what most realtors did, and I saw a lot of transactions, violated the law, and what they would do is they slip these buyer broker fee agreements in, not before they showed them houses, not before they provided buyer brokerage services. They'd slip them into the same e-signing session as the purchase agreement. So you get this 40 document package, typically signed on a phone at a last minute in an awful distressful situation. And that's when they would do it. So there was no way to cancel these contracts. You take a look at these standard form realtor contracts. It says the only way you can cancel is if all parties mutually agree. Guess who's not going to agree? So when you hear this is nothing new, remember they're taking credit for following a law they routinely violated for decades. All right, so I want you to look closely at this one. This is a net sheet I put together to try and explain why coupling commissions is bad. Coupling means when the listing broker collects the buyer broker fee and then pays it to the buyer broker. That's the practice that needs to stop. So when you hear people talking about uncoupling, that's what they're talking about. So when realtors push sellers to offer money to buyer brokers through the listing broker, it's a trap. Look at how it affects these transactions. And I can barely see it. In column 1 is the traditional transaction, and you can see the listing broker is collecting 3.1, I think it is, and the buyer broker is 3.3, and the buyer broker is collecting 2.7. Adds up to $56,700 in commissions being paid. What happens if the buyer agent uses a discount broker on the buy side and only pays 1%, $94.50? All that happens is it shifts the savings to the listing broker. It doesn't go to the seller. It should, but this is how these listing contracts were set up, and this is why coupling is so bad. Bringing an attorney in is even worse, because you might have an attorney who's only charging $5,000, which is still a lot of money, on the buy side, and that's a lot of hours that an attorney's putting into that transaction, probably more than a realtor in a lot of cases. But the listing contract says that they're only going to share those fees, that 2.7%, with buyer brokers, not with attorneys. So what you've just done is forfeited that buyer broker commission to the listing broker, not to the seller, which might make your offer more appealing. Same thing with DIY buyers. They'd go into an open house and they'd try to negotiate, and they never would realize what happened because they'd never see the seller's settlement statement, but they never got the savings. So this is the system as it was. All right, need to move on here. Oh, yes, bribery. Minnesota law makes it a crime to offer anything of value to someone else's fiduciary, like a buyer broker, if it's meant to entice them or sway their advice. For years, brokers relied on the usually accepted business practice safe harbor or exception to the bribery law. Since all realtors had to include, if they put a property on the MLS, they had to include an offer of compensation to buyer brokers, this would normally fit within the bribery statute, but they would argue, well, it fell into within the exception. But the settlement disallows offers of compensation because on the MLS. So that's no longer a standard accepted practice. So what used to be business as usual now could easily be construed to be a crime. When a listing broker offers money to a buyer broker, that bribe, it's meant to entice the buyer broker to bring their client to the property, that's called steering, and it too is illegal. The buyer broker is supposed to be loyal to the buyer, but this payment, this secret payment, created a direct conflict. It rewarded them for steering clients towards certain homes and away from others. Our case included piles of evidence showing that buyers were steered towards listings with higher payouts. When you hear agents talk about cooperation, they're talking about the co-op fee, the sharing of these commissions, understand what that really means is bribery and steering. Some listing brokers, on top of the 2.7 they were offering, because I'm sorry, but that is what the standard became here in Minnesota, offered added payments to those amounts. And they called them bonuses or incentives to try and make them sound nice. Listing brokers were actually bonusing buyer brokers if those buyer brokers could convince their buyers to purchase the house. These were designed to influence the advice and counsel of another party's fiduciary. It's bribery in its purest form. Other times they flipped it though. There was a case that I had gotten started many, many years ago. A large brokerage publicly offered the standard rate on the MLS, but they sent out secret certified letters to all the smaller and mid-sized brokers telling them the secret amounts in the MLS didn't apply to them. They would only get 2%. The goal was in direct conflict with their duty to the sellers. They wanted to limit the market exposure of the home to improve their chances of getting a double commission. Dual agency is that profitable. Whether the tactic is to lure or repel, the purpose is identical. It's to manipulate commissions to steer buyer agents. It's okay to pay your agent a bonus, but when you pay somebody else's, it becomes a bribe. The next level, though, is you got to remember that bribery is still a bribe, even if it's disclosed. But if you hide it from your client, you had fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, theft by swindle, wire fraud. And after a loss, like the Moehrl case, also known as the Sitzer case, that's the copycat lawsuit that we worked with, repeating the scheme off MLS seems to invite criminal analysis and scrutiny. It's not just an antitrust case anymore. These are real screenshots from pre-settlement. In fact, there are still some agents trying to do this today, which doesn't make any sense. Listing brokers had sellers pay thousands, even tens of thousands of dollars, straight to the other side's fiduciary through secret communications. These are from emails that are only sent out to agents. No other fiduciary profession would allow something like this, and our Department of Commerce couldn't care less. I reported it to them, but like so many other, I've heard this from many attorneys, it was a joke to report anything to the real estate division of the Commerce Department here. Try and do a search on enforcement actions and see if any of the big companies show up, and you'll come up empty-handed. The NAR settlement was meant to end these bonuses and restore client loyalty. But it's only one class action. And it was framed around offering commissions on the MLS. So we can't expect one class action to change everything. It was meant to open the door, and we're hoping to see more cases, unless the industry actually fixes itself, which doesn't seem real likely based on what I'm seeing. So now you know how bad it was before our case came along. Even after we filed our case, it was a bombshell. It made front page news everywhere. It was the end of real estate as we know it were the predictions. NAR and the MLSs realized that this was an important case and that it wasn't going to be like all the others that had failed. So they scrambled to make some changes even before there were any rulings. So one of the things was they made it unethical for buyer agents to tell their buyers that they worked for free. They actually said that. And they started publishing buyer broker fees that were secret in the past. And if you knew to look for them, you could find them. Redfin often did a good job telling you how much was being offered by the broker. Most antitrust cases against NAR failed miserably. I watched them for decades and I saw the mistakes lawyers were making. I just happened to be boots on the ground in the trenches. I knew a lot about this industry and I could see how they were failing on a lot of these cases. Our case was the first of its kind. Estimated damages were between 50 to 100 billion, some even said $200 billion. But about 1.5 months later, after we filed our case, the Sitzer copycat case, along with, there were many others too, was filed in Missouri. These were much smaller cases. The defendants, though, didn't have enough money to pay even their damages, let alone ours. Our case focused on the fee collusion through the MLS. Sitzer ended up getting the fast track to trial, so we worked closely with them to make sure we got a joint win. The jury took less than 2.5 hours to deliver a $1.8 billion verdict against the big brokers and NAR. Under antitrust law, that number was tripled to over $5 billion. This was money, even at this level, in this small state action, they didn't have this amount of money. They didn't even have the money, the bond money, to appeal this case. So then comes our settlement. Here are some of the key points of the settlement, at least for this talk today. There's a lot more going on, and there's a lot more things I could be talking about, but this is some of the more important stuff. Before a buyer agent can take you on a tour, there must be a signed buyer agreement that clearly states the compensation. No longer is it legal for them to say, whatever the seller's paying me, that's my fee. They can't do that. It has to be a set amount, and it cannot change. So they're not allowed to collect more than what is in that fee agreement. So if there's a bonus being offered, they can't accept it. The old system of dangling money to buyer brokers makes no sense now, because if the buyer and the buyer agent have to negotiate a fee agreement before they even start showing a house, well, the listing broker doesn't have any idea how much that buyer agent's getting paid, right? So how much would you offer? If you offer them too much, well, they can't accept it. So it makes no sense to be offering money to buyer brokers anymore because of this case. You'd like to think. The settlement was supposed to deliver a lot. Shouldn't need rebates anymore. No more bonuses, no more steering. No more fees offered on the MLS. Well, that one is a definite. No more I work for free claims. That one is accomplished. Buyer broker fees are supposed to be fully negotiated now. On paper, it meant a cleaner market with clear rules, fewer conflicts. In reality, though, it only works if everyone plays by the rules. But here's what it would look like if you uncoupled the fees. Look how it brings in competition. So when I say uncouple the fees, that means the listing broker charges 2%, maybe the buyer broker charges 1%. No longer is it coupled together into one fee that defaults and is diverted to the listing broker. So, with a discount broker in column 2, they're charging 1% on this $945,000 house. Look how it improved the seller's net down below. Instead of $888,000 in a traditional deal, It's 904. And I'll tell you what, we shouldn't be calling them discount brokers. Most of the discount brokers are simply charging a fair fee, and they know that gouging is taking place. So take a look and compare the services you're getting. You'll find they're often the same. If you get an attorney helping on a transaction where there's a listing broker involved, no longer is it going to cost more. The listing broker is charging that ridiculous $31,000 figure for doing next to nothing, and I know because I do what they do. Now the attorney's charging $5,000, and look how that improved the net. And then, of course, if you have two attorneys involved in the deal and no listing broker, and that could happen today and could have happened prior, but look at the difference in the proceeds. It makes a huge difference. And when you hear brokers talking about how, well, when you do a for sale by owner, you need to understand MLS transactions sell for, they have some ridiculous number, 25% more than for sale by owner properties. They're taking a National Association of Realtors statistic that says that, I remember what it is now. It says that for sale by owner homes sell for $48,000 less than MLS transactions. All the statistic is saying is that people who went for sale by owner listed their house for a lower price than what the realtors were. So it's just the median price is what they were talking about. They completely misconstrued these numbers, and you will hear realtors tell you this. Anytime you start talking about it for sale by owner, they'll say, well, MLS, you list with the MLS, you're gonna get $48,000 more. That's not what the statistic says. So anyhow, I need to kind of move along here because I'm talking too long. This was the first study after the settlement happened, and you'll see commissions came down quite a bit, actually, at first. For the first time, it looked like we had a free market on fees. Competition was finally starting to happen. You take a look at these maps, and for some reason, the Midwest has the highest commission rates in the country. And I've talked to a lot of consumer lawyers who say some of the worst business practices in the country start here in Minnesota. And this is one of them. But instead of embracing reform, the industry went right back to the same collusive conduct that got them sued. The only change, instead of offering compensation on the MLS to buyer brokers, is they're now just offering it off the MLS. They're trying to make it more secretive, but they're doing it. And it's impacting commissions in a bad way because now rates are going back up again. So here's a clause that, as a result of the settlement, that the Realtor Association put in their purchase agreement. This is a new clause, and it basically says it was designed, at least to make buyers and sellers think this. It was designed to let buyers and buyer brokers set their own fees together. And then if the buyer can't afford to pay the buyer broker fee, which is pretty common, they just ask the seller to pay it. But take a look at that last sentence. I can't see it. It talks about, in addition to the listing broker's offer of cooperating compensation. So in other words, this amount you put in here is an addition to what they're offering you, what they're offering secretly behind closed doors to buyer brokers. It's a gotcha clause. Always strike that last sentence, no matter what, if you're working with a buyer on a deal. It's designed to increase the seller's cost by whatever amount is in that line that you negotiated with your buyer broker. The last sentence is basically a double hit. So in other words, if the listing broker is charging 6%, offering 2.7 to the buyer broker, and you put 2.7 in there because you have one of these fixed rate, these realtors that are still engaged in price fixing, instead of paying a total of 6%, it now just went up to 8.7. They did this by design. This is in their purchase agreement, if you can imagine such a thing. So always strike that last sentence, no matter what. Let's see. Some of this stuff's complicated, and I'm sorry. It's not my fault. But the NAR settlement prohibits offers of buyer-broker compensation through the MLS. They can't offer money in the MLS anymore. So it addresses steering, but only on the MLS. That's all our case did. It also says it does not prevent offers of competition off the MLS. That language means the settlement does not speak to the off-MLS conduct. It doesn't mean that it authorizes it, that they can go and do this collusion off the MLS. Neither plaintiffs nor a judge can grant legal immunity for collusion. Off MLS price fixing remains subject to the same antitrust law. This was just saying that our case doesn't address this issue. But the realtors, they took this language and they misconstrued it, and they're out there saying nothing has changed. They're bragging that the scheme didn't stop; it just moved off the MLS. And so, just so you can see that I'm not completely crazy about this, here's the president of the National Association of Realtors after this settlement talking about the settlement.
First is that we will be changing the rule that will prohibit the offer of cooperating compensation on the MLS. Please hear me clearly. You will still be able to offer compensation to a buyer broker. It just cannot be conveyed on the MLS. And if there's one thing I know about members, they will figure out how to efficiently communicate the information to see if there will be any cooperating compensation.
Wow, it gives me chills every time I watch that. Straight from the president of NAR, the settlement says you can't fix competitor fees on the MLS, so what's the industry solution? Let's do it off the MLS. It's the same collusive scheme, simply moved to a different venue. Offering compensation to buyer brokers only works if those brokers are willing to violate the spirit and very likely the letter of the settlement. This is an op-ed by Chris Kelly, the CEO of Home Services. And he wrote this, it's not in the New York Times, it was in a real estate journal that is only read by realtors. He claims the settlement directs commissions to be offered off the MLS, and that somehow this makes it all more transparent. The settlement does not direct collusion off the MLS. The settlement bans collusion and price fixing through the MLS. That's all our case addressed. So he also says buyers and sellers are now having clear, unvarnished conversations about fees. There is zero evidence of that. What we're actually seeing is the same fee coordination, just hidden from public view. They're just concealing it from the clients better. So again, I'm going to repeat the same slide that you saw before. Remember that when a listing broker advises you or your client to collect a 6% fee and offer money to buyer brokers, there's really no good reason to do it because the buyers have a signed fee agreement. That fee can't be changed. The listing side doesn't know what that fee is, and so there's no good reason. There's no legitimate transactional reason to send money to the buyer's broker under these rules. So why would they keep doing it? Reason number one, to signal what buyer brokers should be charging. This is very similar to the conduct they just got sued for and lost, and only now it's happening off the MLS. It's basically a private billboard visible only to realtors telling every buyer broker you should be charging 2.7%. That's signaling. It's not cooperation. It's price fixing, and it works. It keeps rates artificially inflated. I am seeing 2.7% on nearly all deals now. It sends competitors the message, and it preserves the price fixing scheme without leaving a paper trail. But there's another reason why these commissions are staying high. They want to capture the savings that should be going to the seller, and they want to divert that to the listing broker. So if a buyer negotiates a lower buyer broker fee, and then they offer that in the purchase agreement that they're only asking for, say, 1%, as is in this example right here, you'd think the buyer would have a negotiating advantage in a multiple offer situation, right, where other offers are asking for 2.7%. The seller would be happy because it's going to improve their net. They're going to save 1.7%. That's what you think's happening. That's the way the agreement wants you. That's what the agreements seem to be designed to do, but that's not what's happening. If the listing broker is using the standard realtor fee contract and has checked line 124, offer cooperating broker compensation, you've just forfeited the savings. Strike that whole thing, by the way, if you see that on a listing contract. The boilerplate at lines 133 through 135 diverts the savings straight to the listing broker. There's no negotiation, no disclosure. There's no way to change it on this form. They just automatically get it. And this is what's happening today. Both sides expect that savings are going to help make the deal better. Instead, the contract quietly diverts it to the listing broker. And that's just one way they grab the money. And this is another reason why they want to couple fees together. So let's see, I think, how am I doing on time? Oh my gosh, I'm going to run out, aren't I? So after they rig the contracts, they rig the conversation. They're lying to buyers and sellers. They're telling sellers, for example, if you want buyers, agents to show your home, you should offer them money. But that's false. There's no reason to offer buyer brokers money. They can just put it in the purchase agreement, as you saw before. They don't need any offers of compensation, and there's no practical way to do it. Buyers, they're telling them, well, are you sure you want me to show you homes where you might have to pay my fee out of pocket? I don't know in what world they're talking about, because if you have it in the purchase agreement and the seller says no, well, you walk away from that deal. The deal didn't happen. The risk does not exist, and that doesn't happen either. The seller's looking at the net. Both scripts have the same goal: scare buyers and sellers into giving up savings and keep the old commission scheme running off the MLS. The bad workaround that isn't available in the listing contract is instead the seller offers the 3% or 2.7 off the MLS, but they offer it to the buyer agents. At least this way, if it's the seller offering the money, any savings will go back to the seller, but you still got the seller paying a bribe to somebody else's fiduciary, and I don't know if you really want to expose your clients to that. The worst workaround is the one they're doing, and this is in their listing contract, where the listing broker still collects 6%, and as we've been talking about, then offers the money off the MLS. So I can't see what slide number that is, but anyhow, did I skip one? Okay, my apologies. So add this language to the other section of the listing contract. What it does is it directs any savings from the listing broker, so if there's savings because the buyer negotiated a better deal on the commission and put it in the purchase agreement, you want that savings to go to the seller, right? You don't want the listing broker to keep it. So I have not perfected this language yet. I just designed it the other day, and so it needs to be vetted in a big way. Create your own, but I think you get the idea. You need something like this in order to fix these listing contracts. This is something sellers are not going to know how to do. Offer the money to the buyer. Why would you bother offering it to the buyer broker and risk all the problems that come with that? Let the buyer decide how they use it. If they want to use it to pay for a broker, or closing costs, or an attorney, let them decide. Don't force them to use a buyer broker by offering the money only to buyer brokers. This puts the control where it belongs, with a buyer and seller, and it removes any incentives for brokers to game the system or hide fees. So always strike that clause. Don't even check shall not. Strike the whole thing. Send a message to them that you're not going to tolerate language like this in a listing contract, especially in a standard fee agreement. This is why the Bar Association, we need to get together and draft a consumer-friendly listing contract and a consumer-friendly buyer representation contract. The only honest way is to strike out that clause and negotiate how much your listing broker is going to get. And I'll tell you what, 1%, I charge 1.5%, and I'm an attorney doing this, and I feel like I'm overcharging when I do that. And we provide a lot of services, and no, I'm not looking for business. I'm just trying to prove a point, and I want to get other attorneys doing this. This is how it should work. If there's no buyer agent, well, then it stays at that 1% figure. If there's an attorney, it stays at that 1% figure. That's the way a free market works. You use that other clause, and you've just engaged in collusion. And by the way, there are plenty of small and mid-sized brokers, even some large ones, that are doing exactly this. They're not putting 1% in there, but they're only charging the listing broker fee. Some of the big brokers are not. They're still trying to convince people to do it the old-fashioned way. But that steals money from your sellers. So if you've got a company that's not willing to do this, you need to say next. Oh, sorry, we're gonna skip ahead here. I've got a couple minutes here. Bonuses are still happening. I get emails all the time from listing agents sending stuff like this. It's unbelievable. And I got into it with one of them. And I asked, and I said, you can't do this. This is a violation of the settlement agreement. She sent it to her broker, who sent it to their counsel, and that's the response I got back. Outside the MLS, the listing agent can do whatever they want to entice a buyer's broker. I'm sorry, you can. It's okay to go ahead and bribe somebody else's fiduciary. That's what he's saying. And he's an attorney that is well known and represents a lot of brokers out there. I'll let you decide what's sound advice in that situation. Okay, well, it doesn't have to be the last one, but I think it's going to be based on my time. What I'm doing is what I want to train other attorneys to do, and I want to do it nationally. Attorneys can compete with realtors. You don't have to be a realtor, like, go out there and show houses. I use showing agents to do it. They charge me, I don't know, it's $45 to go open the door. They're not allowed to give brokerage advice. If my clients like the house, I have them video call me. And it's so easy to do. You need to get your broker's license, because even though the licensing statute says you don't need a broker's license to do this, an attorney's license will suffice, good luck getting access to the MLS and the realtor forms, because their rules are different, and they say you have to have a broker's license. So you're gonna have to take the stupid CE stuff that to keep your real estate license, but you don't wanna be both. You wanna just represent these people as an attorney, and you use that real estate license purely for access to these tools. And that's how I do it. That's at least my opinion on the best way to do it. And so I don't get paid commissions. I get paid legal fees. So if I collect, and I always ask for 2.7%, and this is why buyer brokers are doing this, they're all asking for 2.7% right now, because if they ask for less than that, they're just giving it to the listing broker. So now everybody thinks they got to charge 2.7, and that's what you're seeing out there. That's what I do. I collect the 2.7. It goes in my trust account, unearned fees. Those are not my fees. Those are my clients. That's my client's money. And once it closes and that money has cleared, I refund that money to my clients, less my legal fees, which turns out to be about half of what a realtor is charging. So there is a way to do this as an attorney, and it's taken me a lot of years to figure out how to do it. And I want to share that with attorneys, and that would be a whole other course. But that's the end goal, is I want to see competition. And you get one lawyer in your office doing this, and I did 50 deals last year. I'm one of the top 100 realtors in Minnesota. I hate that, but it's easy to do, and I don't do any marketing. Well, I guess this would be considered that, but I don't do stuff like this. It's easy to do, and you can totally run circles around realtors, because you're never going to be a dual agent. You understand real estate a lot better than they do. I'm sorry, you just do. So, and with that, I'm going to close. There's definitely more information I could do, but I think I don't remember what time I'm allowed to talk to, and there's not much room for questions. So if you've got a couple, please let me know. Yes, please.
I'm curious about what was it about your lawsuit that the settlement was specific to the MLS and not a general sort of promising of compensation?
Well, when I sat down and looked at this case, yeah, I do a lot in the fiduciary law area. It was a fiduciary law breach. It was a bribery case. It was a deceptive practices case. It was an antitrust case. When you're trying to design a cause of action that's going to get you a win, you've got to make sure that, from a strategic point, that you're not going to fail on certain things like class certification. And so the lawyers I met with over at Cohen-Milstein, when I came up with the idea that this needs to be an antitrust case, and then we honed it down to the point where the easiest way to get a win is to just do the case with the MLS, because on the MLS, all realtors were forced to pay a commission to buyer brokers. That was one of the rules. So it was an easy one to call attention to, and so that's why we went that avenue.
So your settlement had to be restricted to that?
Yes. Yes, I think it's wide open for another case right now. But I think this one probably needs to settle first. Or it's settled, but it needs to get through the appeal. And then I think another case would be a great idea. Any other questions? Come on, Dave. All right, I guess I'm done. Thank you. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Doug. We're going to take our lunch break now, and sessions will pick up back at 12:30. So